Thanks for joining us again this morning. And we are going to redo chapter 21. We had some major issues with Comcast. Uh, I don't know what was going on, but we had somebody out yesterday, and hopefully it has been fixed and maybe even a permanent fix. So technology is great when it works. When it doesn't work, then it's not so great. So beginning with today, then, in my post related to this particular chapter, I emphasized in particular that this was a chapter about impatience. How Satan uses or tempts us into being impatient with each other. And that's true for the first half of this chapter. But the second half of the chapter, it's not so much that. The second half of the chapter is more about um, God's ownership over all of our lives, and um, so the link here is how we get impatient with our time, as if it were our own, and it's not. And so Lewis then begins to make some really poignant comments about time as it really is, not time as we see it. So I have some texts then that have to deal with both of those, and so I'll give them to you, and you can feel free to follow along or write them down, but they are helpful, I think. So in terms of being patient, I think one of the controlling biblical thoughts here would come from Proverbs 14, verse 29. Proverbs 14, verse 29. Whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who has a hasty temper exalts folly. Whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who has a hasty temper exalts folly. And so here we have a text that has to do with, being circumspect, not being reactive, but instead being responsive. Those two words are very different from each other. Although some people might say they are synonyms, they, in many respects, are not synonyms. To react is to do something at the moment, oftentimes out of fear. To respond doesn't necessarily have a time component to it. You take time to be circumspect, to think through what actually happened, and was it good? Was it bad? And then how should I respond to that? What's the best way to deal with whatever is happening that's unfolded in front of me? So there is a difference there. And so whoever is slow to anger has great understanding. So that person, there's wisdom associated with that. You understand that there's more at play, that, as my former sociology professor used to say, there's always a reality beyond the one that you perceive. And so a person who responds sees those other realities, and then works at trying to figure out how to respond to them in a productive way, in a helpful way. A person who has a hasty temper exalts folly. I mean, you lift up being stupid and being foolish. You privilege it over other things. So that's kind of what's going on there. And then the next, I think, really helpful, pivotal passage is from, not surprisingly, the book of Philippians. And so in the book of Philippians chapter 4, we read, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your reasonableness be made known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, Let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And so here we have, regardless of our circumstances, um, the Apostle Paul is saying that one of our first responses should always be that of rejoicing. That doesn't mean if somebody's passed away or someone's been injured that we rejoice. It doesn't mean that we don't respond. And it doesn't even mean there's an element of reaction to that. But on the whole, there is a need for us to look at all of our circumstances and to rejoice because God is at work. And there isn't anything that God does not have the ability to redeem. Uh, and so you might think, how is that possible, even among the most horrible of circumstances? God's sovereignty is such that he can transcend all that in a way that can impact every player, everything that's involved in that. And it's trusting him for that. It's a matter of trusting. And so the Apostle Paul, I mean, if you read in, I believe, 1 Corinthians chapter 9 about his litany of things that he experienced and went through, I mean, that's much of the backdrop that Paul still says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. And, in our current rage culture, there isn't much in the way of reasonableness. It's so much of it is reaction, um, and even a certain degree of, planned reaction, insidiousness. So the Lord is at the hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication, in everything, regardless of what is going on. So, Paul also talks about how it's important to pray without ceasing, and that when we're in a constant heart of prayer, reactions, the kind and the number of reactions that we have dissipates. A heart of prayer is what helps us to respond and keeps us from reacting. So to pray without ceasing, to be in constant contact in communication with the Holy Spirit and with God, that is what helps us to keep from reacting. So just a couple of key texts about that. The other thing I want to mention too, in preparation for this particular chapter, has to do with time. And again, Lewis just is so insightful here, but I want to read to you just a couple of passages related to time. Again, back in Proverbs, Solomon says, "The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps." So, that's kind of what I was saying about how God can redeem anything that comes our way. We plan, but the Lord is the one who establishes, who guides our steps. And in the end, it's his sovereign will that works itself out, regardless of what we do. We, humanity can make any decision that humanity wants to make. Every human being, all 7.5 billion of us, can make whatever decision we want to make. And not one of us can impact the overarching plan and will of God. Not one. Not all 0.75 billion of us who live in these autonomous relationships with each other and here on this planet, we are self-ruling. We are self-determining. We make our own choices and decisions, and yet, even as we plan our way, the Lord establishes his steps that ultimately God's will prevail. And so there is this matrix, this kind of economy of sorts where God is absolutely sovereign on one hand, and we are absolutely self-determining on the other hand, and yet still, because of God's absolute sovereignty, his will still works itself out perfectly, and our plans work themselves out in ways that are anything but perfect. So the other passage of scripture that I'd like to share with you is from First John. In First John chapter 2, he says, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and the pride of life is not from the Father, but from the world." Then verse 17, "And the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever." So this has to do, with how we spend our time, and the results of how we spend our time, the repercussions and the rewards of how we spend our time. So there are many more texts associated with that kind of use of time that we could talk about. Uh, Four other texts, or at least the core of the text I want to share with you very quickly, have to do with what God owns. So, no matter how we spend our time, no matter what we think is ours within the framework of time, it's not ours at all. And so we read here in Isaiah 43:1, for example, where God declares that he owns Israel. And so from the very beginning, God makes this declaration about how he owns this nation. It belongs to him, and he has a special purpose and plan for it. And then in 1 Corinthians 6, 19 through 21, 1 Corinthians 6, 19 through 21, uh, Paul says that God owns the Christian, for you were bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God with your body. Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit? So, and so God makes this declaration about how he owns us as a believer, that we are his and that he owns us, that we are not our own. Uh, and if you match that statement with how we live our lives, there tends to be a rather large incongruity between those two things, don't there? Isn't there? And then in Ezekiel 18:4, this kind of sobering statement where Ezekiel declares that God owns our souls. He owns our souls. No one else owns our souls. We're responsible for our souls, but he owns them. We are stewards of our souls, but God owns them. They are not ours. We are not free to do with them whatever we want. And then in Psalm 24:1 and 1 Corinthians 10:26, God owns the universe, everything in it, all of it, God owns. It's not ours, everything. So not just the world and the stars and the moon and the quasars and all that kind of stuff. God owns every stick of furniture in our home. He owns every thread of cloth on our back. He owns absolutely everything. It is his. He made it, and it's supposed to serve a divine purpose. So these are radical declarations that God makes, and I don't think that they are the kind of declarations out of which most of us live our lives in an intimate fashion, in a way like, where it's a controlling thing on a regular basis. We tend to think of those things as belonging to us, and that God has some say, but at the end of the day, they belong to us. And so it's not that at all. So let's begin with this particular chapter, chapter 21. My dear Wormwood, yes, a period of sexual temptation is an excellent theme for working in a subordinate attack on the patient's peevishness. So this is a theme that Lewis gets at here. I would say this is maybe the fourth or fifth time, that maybe sixth time that Lewis works into this theme, sexual temptation. So it's a prevailing thought in the day and time of Lewis, not surprisingly, and so it's here, and it's how to use sexual temptation to establish a kind of peevishness or impatience. It may even be the main attack as long as he thinks it is the subordinate one. But here, as with everything else, the way must be prepared for your moral assault by darkening his intellect. Men are not angered by mere misfortune, but by misfortune conceived as injury. So, what he's saying here is when we get angry about certain things that happen that we don't think should happen, there are many things that happen of which there is no control. We cannot control hurricanes. We can't control blizzards. We can't control what happens to our bodies. There are people out there who make honest mistakes, and they think they're doing the right thing, or something happens, or whatever, and so they really can't control that. And it impacts other people's lives, maybe our lives, and we understand that it can't be controlled. But Lewis says to, or Screwtape says to Wormwood, but if you can get what cannot be controlled to be interpreted as being personal, like a personal attack, then that changes the calculus of the whole thing. Men are not angered, so what's the issue here? Anger by misfortune, what's happening, something that should not have happened but does, but by the misfortune conceived or thought of as injury. So and so you feel personally injured by whatever misfortune, and who is responsible for that, and why did they do that or not do that. So I mean, there's a whole industry of injury lawyers that prey on this very thing. I mean, that's what happens here with injury lawyers, is that if they don't do it, they capitalize on people who feel as if they've been angered by some misfortune that may not have been anybody's fault, but oftentimes can be crafted as someone's fault, and therefore there's liability. And the sense of injury depends on the feeling that a legitimate claim has been denied. This should not have happened, but it did. This should not have happened, but you did it. Those kinds of things. The more claims on life, therefore, that your patient can be induced to make, the more claims where something should not have happened or something should happen that your patient can make, the more often he will feel injured and as a result, ill-tempered. So, and I had family members who were like that, that was how they lived their lives. That something should have but didn't, and so they were angry about it, always angry about it, ill-tempered because of how they've been taken advantage of or imposed upon or had to pay for something they felt like they should not have had to pay for. All of those kinds of things. Now you will have noticed that nothing throws him into a passion so easily as to find a tract of time which he reckoned on having at his own disposal, unexpectedly taken from him. So he's saying here, look, people parse out their time, and they want to put certain things into that time that they believe belong to them. So the framework or the block of time belongs to them, and the thing they want to put into it belongs to them. And when they can't put the thing they think belongs to them into that time they think belongs to them, then they get angry, they get irritated, they get frustrated by it. And it's one of those prevailing things when we feel as if when people interrupt our time. And I can't help but feel that this was in part, Lewis was really being autobiographical here. I mean, I think that if I, having taught in higher education and knowing the way in which students can oftentimes interrupt you, the unreasonable demands that sometimes the administration places on you, all of those kinds of things, and it interrupts what you really want to do. You want to be reading, you want to be studying, you want to have in-depth conversations with colleagues or with students that matter, and here you're having to do these other things that really are inconsequential to a large degree to you, but apparently, seemingly consequential to the people who place those demands, those spontaneous demands on that block of time that you had set aside for something else other than dealing with them. And so that happens at work, that happens with our children, that happens with our grandchildren, that happens with your neighbors. It happens when you get a knock at the door and somebody needs to use your phone because they have a flat tire. Any number of things like that it happens with. So now you will have noticed that nothing throws him into a passion so easily as to find a tract of time which he reckoned on having as at his own disposal and unexpectedly taken from him. It is the unexpected visitor when he looked forward to a quiet evening, or the friend's talkative wife turning up when he looked forward to a tete-a-tete with that friend, that throws him out of gear. Now, he is not yet so uncharitable or slothful that these small demands on his courtesy are in themselves too much. So, look, we all have those micro interventions throughout the course of our day, and most of us can absorb them and handle them in a way that's reasonable and healthy. They anger him because he regards his time as his own and feels as if it's being stolen. And so, the more our time is being stolen from us, the more angry and the more frustrated we get. Now, there is a certain sense in which, particularly in the work world, where you simply understand that part of your job is to be interrupted, to get a bunch of phone calls, to have people stop by. It's just part of your job. You're supposed to answer questions. But it's when you hive out, it's when you block off certain sections of time and say, I just need this for me, either to get my work done or to have some kind of rehabilitation time. That's when those kinds of things constantly get interrupted. That's when we get increasingly more and more frustrated. So he goes on to say, you must therefore zealously guard in his mind that curious assumption, my time is my own. So Lewis is talking big picture here, and this is a very interesting sentence. You must therefore zealously guard in his mind the curious assumption that my quote, my time is my own, period, end quote. So Lewis is calling into question this whole idea of whether or not our time is our time. There's no question that the believers are stewards of their time, but that's not how we live our lives in many cases. We live our lives as if we are the masters of, the owners of our time. Um, and so we are confused between what we own and what we are stewards of. That our time is a commodity that has been given to us to use in a way that serves and glorifies God. That's what our time is for. But that's not how most of us live our lives. It's almost inverted, so that we are the owners of our time, and one of the pieces that works itself into that that time period is God, among many other things. So it's Sunday morning worship or Bible study or the Lenten service on Wednesday night. We fit it in, and that's almost the opposite of how it's supposed to be. And that's what Lewis is getting at here. He goes on to say, let him have the feeling that he starts each day as the lawful possessor of 24 hours. Let him feel as a grievous tax that portion of this property which he has to make over to his employers, and as a generous donation that further portion which he allows to religious duties. And so it's a tax that people demand of him, so they take a certain portion of his time. Or if he gives it, it's a generous donation. Like, I'm doing the church a favor. I'm doing God a favor by doing these kinds of things. It's what I do with my time. Uh, and if I can't do it on my own and somebody takes it, then it's a tax from my employer or other people to whom I am responsible for. But what he must never be permitted to doubt is that the total from which these deductions have been made was, in some mysterious sense, his own personal birthright. This is my time. You are taxing my time. And if you want me to do this, I will donate some of my time for you. And so there's a kind of almost for some people it's like just irrational, this kind of sense of time that they have, and how it belongs to them. They are a fascist with it. So you have here a delicate task. The assumption which you want him to go on making is so absurd. If once it is questioned, even we cannot find a shred of argument in its defense. That so so Screwtape is saying, look, the obvious fact that God is the author and the creator of time, and that it does not belong to anybody other than to him. He said this is so obvious if you think about it, that even Satan and his minions have no argument against it. They can't even they can't even. And so what we don't want, he says, is for the patient to begin to think about, I am a steward of time as opposed to an owner of time. So the assumption which you want him to go on making is so absurd. If once it is questioned, even we cannot find a shred of argument in its defense. The man can neither make nor retain one moment of time. It all comes to him by pure gift. He might as well regard the sun and the moon as his chattels. He is also, in theory, committed to a total service of the enemy. And if the enemy appeared to him in bodily form and demanded that total service for even one day, he would not refuse. So if God made it obvious by appearing to us during a certain day that he wants that day for him, we would say, well, okay, that's not a problem. What can we do? What do you want us to do? Because we would readily admit, we would confess, we would concede that time belongs to God. It's not ours. It belongs to him. So if God were present right now in our lives and said, I want the next 24 hours, there would be no question about what we would do those 24 hours. None at all. We would immediately concede those 24 hours belong to him. And we are at, and so by extension, then, even though God has not appeared to us and is standing in front of us, that still doesn't deny the fact that every day belongs to him. It's his time. So God, what do you want us to do with it? How can we help you? Those kinds of things. He would, so then he goes on to say, he would be greatly relieved if that one day involved nothing harder than listening to the conversation of a foolish woman, and he would be relieved almost to the pitch of disappointment if for 1/2 hour in that day the enemy said, now you may go and amuse yourself. So he's saying, so if God appeared to us and asked us to do the most mundane of things, we would be thrilled to do it. And if during that same time God said, now take a 1/2 hour, do whatever you want, we would be disappointed because we were in his presence. We would be, it's his very presence that would compel us to use every second in his service. His presence would compel us to use every second in his service. And if he said, now you have a 1/2 hour to go and do whatever you want to, we would be disappointed. Like, what do you mean? You don't want us to be around you anymore? Like, you don't have anything for us to do? That's the equation. That's really the dynamic of what is going on. Now, if he thinks about his assumption for a moment that his time is his time, Even he is bound to realize that he is actually in this situation every day. When I speak of preserving this assumption in his mind, therefore, the last thing I mean you to do is to furnish him with arguments in his defense. Don't get him to be thinking about why his time is his time, why it belongs to him. There aren't any. So there are no arguments in the light of God about why my time is my time. You would awaken with him that very sense if you try to create those arguments of defense. Your task is purely negative. Don't let his thoughts come anywhere near it. Wrap, wrap a darkness around it, and in the center of that darkness, let his sense of ownership in time lie silent, unsuspected, and operative. So let him always act out of a sense that this is my time, but never let him think this is my time over and against the fact that it's really God's time. Don't let him think that way at all. Keep that thought wrapped up in darkness. The sense of ownership in general is always to be encouraged. The humans are always putting up claims to ownership which sound equally funny in heaven and in hell. So Lewis expands his discussion a little bit here from ownership to time to ownership of anything, of anything. He's getting at we don't own anything. And the fact, and when we say we own something, he's saying it just sounds absurd within the context of heaven, and even absurd within the context of hell. One of the few things that heaven and hell probably agree on is the absurdity of humans who say they own anything, right? That's what he's saying here. So let me just read it again. The sense of ownership in general is always to be encouraged. The humans are always putting up claims to ownership which sound equally funny in heaven and in hell, and we must keep them doing so. Much of the modern resistance to chastity comes from men's beliefs. So he's rounding back around again to one sexuality. Much of the modern resistance to chastity comes from men's belief that they own their bodies, those vast and perilous estates, pulsating with the energy that made the worlds, and in which they find themselves without their consent, and from which they are ejected at the pleasure of another. And so he's saying, look, you don't even own your body. You may think that you do. And so many arguments within, the socio-political spectrum today is what we get to do with our bodies. So whether it's abortion, whether it's gender identity, whether we feel like we can own somebody, right? 40,000 young adults and children every year cross the border from the South into North America, 40,000 as a part of the sex slave trade. There are people out there who think that it's perfectly appropriate to own the body of another person and to use that body in a way that makes them money. And so there's so many things like that happen in our world today where people have this sense of ownership over their own bodies. And again, it's always a stewardship thing. It's not an ownership thing. He goes on to say, well, and so look, in Lewis, before we go on, he says, look, you think you own your body. It's this vast, perilous world itself, pulsating with the energy that made the worlds. The very energy that made your body is the same energy that made the worlds. And you think you own it? How is that possible? So a few lines down, he says, it is as if a royal child from whom his father has placed, for love's sake, in titular command of some great province, under the real rule of wise counselors, should come to fancy he really owns the cities, the forest, and the corn in the same way he owns the bricks on the nursery floor. And so it's like, this son has been given responsibility of these provinces and stuff like that, and he begins to think he owns them when in fact he's really a steward of them. We produce this sense of ownership not only by pride, but by confusion. We teach them not to notice the different senses of the possessive pronoun, the finely graded differences that run from my boots through my dog, my servant, my wife, my father, my master, and my country to my God. So, the same way in which we say my boots and the sentiment we have with my associated with my boots, that sentiment carries through to my God. So Lewis is saying here, it goes from, look, you not only don't own your own bodies, but there's a certain sense in which when you talk about my anything that you think you own, you carry with it that sense of my God in the same way that you carry with the same sense as my boots, my dog, my home, those kinds of things. The sentiment can never be the same. First of all, they're not even your boots. And secondly, there's no sense in which you own God in any way. And that sentiment that you have for owning my boots should never, ever be even close to the same sense of what it means when you say, my God. That's what he's saying here. I mean, he's really drilling deep here, and he's pounding away with this thought. They can be taught to reduce all these senses to that of my boots, that the my of ownership. Even in the nursery, a child can be taught to mean by my teddy bear, not the old imagined recipient of affection to whom it stands in a special relation, for that is what the enemy will teach them to mean if we are not careful. But the bear I can pull to pieces if I like, because it's mine. At the other end of the scale, we have taught men to say, my God, in a sense not really very different from my boots, meaning, quote, the God on whom I have a claim for my distinguished services and whom I exploit from the pulpit, the God I have done a corner in. So he's put God in a corner in that kind of a way. So Lewis is just attacking on every level this sense of ownership and the absurdity that we own anything, and even attacking the sense of how we often have this kind of ownership over God and use Him. And all the time, the joke is that the word of mine, in its fully possessive sense, cannot be uttered by a human being about anything. In the long run, either our Father or the enemy will say, quote, mine of each thing that exists, and specially of each man. They will find out in the end, never fear, to whom their time, their souls, and their bodies really belong, certainly not to them, whatever happens. At present, the enemy says mine of everything on the pedantic, legalistic grounds that he has made it. Our Father hopes in the end to say, quote, mine of all things in a more realistic and dynamic ground of conquest. And so Satan wants to say mine by the conquest of it. He wants to say your soul is mine because of his conquest. He wants to say that this world is his because of conquest. And God can simply say those things are mine simply because they belong to me. So this is the text, and probably one of the most important chapters Lewis has written here in the Screwtape Letters. And I have to admit to you, I hadn't seen it that way, but having to redo this book, and I've taught on this book at least a dozen times. It's stunning. It's stunning how what you passed over before and failed to see in terms of its significance. You capture much later, and you realize the importance of the discussion in this particular chapter. And so the only response to this chapter is repentance and submission, in terms of my anything. So thanks for joining me this morning. And as I always, feel free to pass this chapter along, pass this study along. I think there are many of us who could really benefit from hearing this. If you like it, make sure you hit the little like thing. But please feel free to share it with others. So thank you very much, and you have a great day. God bless.